Thank you very much, Mr. Panier. So I think we have now established the Trans-Caspian connection and are crossing the sea, and perhaps Mr. Krnjević could tell us more how it looks from the perspective of Azerbaijan and its vicinity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I'm glad to be here. Thank you to FPRI, to Ilia State University, and my fellow panelists. Look, we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the conflict over Ukraine. We wouldn't be having this conversation in this place on this topic if it weren't for that. But not so much the Russian invasion part, but the decision by the West to impose sanctions and export restrictions on the Russians. That's the reason that the Middle Corridor has gained in such strategic importance. It's just one of the consequences of all of this that has happened. But so, and Bruce is completely right that there are a whole bunch of different names and concepts and nascent institutions that are talking about more or less the same thing: Middle Corridor, BRI, Global Gateway, whatever you want. But all in all, whatever you call it, and depending on whether you're emphasizing the Chinese aspect or the Western aspect or whatever, it's basically the only game in town. And all you have to do is look at the map, which is why I've asked to put that up there, right? The Middle Corridor is key to furthering the strategic ambitions in Eurasia of all the major powers. The United States, the European Union and some of its more important member states, Turkey, China, India, you name it. The Middle Corridor is all about connectivity. And there are two really categorical aspects of this. There's the energy aspect, and then there's all the other stuff. Digital infrastructure, security architecture, food supplies, access to critical raw materials, and all of this then needs to be transported. And the only way to do that, going west to east or east to west, is to go through what we're going to call the Middle Corridor, just so that we don't repeat all the terms. And it has essentially three elements, or three aspects. There's the road and rail aspect, so the land aspect. There's the ship aspect, the sea aspect, which involves the Caspian and then later on the Black Sea. And then there's the air aspect, air freight, air cargo, which is, in terms of percentages, very small, but in terms of the strategic flexibility that this gives in terms of just-on-time delivery and all that kind of stuff, air is the way to go. And it just so happens that the second largest freight cargo provider in this part of the world and beyond is based in Baku. So there's a genuinely serious infrastructure aspect to this that is going to get updated and made sort of more and sort of mainstreamed in the time ahead. Central to this, the president or the director of the Alat Free Port, which is really a dry port on the Caspian, south of Baku. His name is Talat Ziyadov. He talks about the importance of understanding places like Alat as five-star hubs, right? Where you can get any service you want, from logistics to because of the free zones, to putting things together, to adding value to goods and services, that kind of thing. And if you think about it, and if you look at the map, you see that Azerbaijan is the indispensable country for addressing all of these strategic ambitions, right? It's the strategic prize, because you can't go north, you can't go south. That's it. Particularly in the context of energy security, of becoming a strategic provider of energy security to Turkey to some extent, but particularly the European Union and to Europe more generally, including the Western Balkans, right? There's a prehistory to this. There's the contract of the century from 1994 that used first existing infrastructure up to Novorossiysk and then Supsa, and then the eventual building of a new flagship oil pipeline, the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. So there's the oil aspect of it. There's the natural gas aspect of it. 1999, the discovery of a massive gas field called Shah Deniz. In 2006, the first phase was launched. The supply of gas to Georgia and to Turkey, about 11 BCM a year. 2013, the second phase was launched. This ultimately led to the construction in a phased way of the Southern Gas Corridor. That added another 16 BCM into the energy mix. Southern Gas Corridor started operating at the end of 2020, fortuitously, given what happened afterwards. An incredibly complex value chain piece of infrastructure, goes through 6 countries, 3,500 kilometers, cost $40 billion to build. And now you've got 10 BCM that's going into the EU via the Southern Gas Corridor, particularly the third part. It's called the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline. Starts at the Turkish-Greek border and ends up in Italy. And there's an undersea aspect to it. And the strategic importance of this, even though it's only 10 BCM, is rooted in the fact that it's designed to be expandable. And when you put that together with the fact that there's this decision now that's been made for the European gas market to divest itself entirely of Russian, well, not entirely, but almost entirely of Russian gas, then all of this genuinely gains in strategic importance. So in 2021, Azerbaijan supplied 4.9% of the gas that was used in Europe. 2022, it turned out it rose to 6.9%. And there's a deal in place, and I'll say something about this in a moment, that's supposed to double the capacity of the Southern Gas Corridor, particularly that third part, the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, that then is likely to see up to 20 and maybe a little more BCM of gas go through that pipeline and supply the European energy market. And basically that means that we're talking about double digits in terms of percentages of gas, of Azerbaijani gas, that's going to be supplied to the European gas market. And because of the way the gas market works, if you take all of the Russian gas, or all of the gas that goes through the Russian pipeline system, you find a situation in which, you're not going to be able to meet the needs without using Azerbaijani gas, even if you go onto the spot market, which is, of course, more expensive and all that business. That's just the way the market works. Now, this isn't even talking about all of the fun stuff that can happen across the Caspian, right? Some of the trading that goes on, that then where you end up maybe kind of sort of perhaps using gas that doesn't originate in Azerbaijan, but putting it in the pipeline system that starts there and goes through Georgia and so on, Turkey, and ultimately into Italy. But at the end of the day, if you look at the strategic equation today, you see that Azerbaijan is really the biggest energy security blanket for the European Union. And you have a long-term strategic energy partnership between the EU and Azerbaijan, and then some of the neighbors by almost implication, and it's based on 2 fundamentally important documents. And it's usually these documents don't mean a lot because it's a lot of just blah blah, but in this case it's genuinely important because it lays the foundation for a long-term strategic partnership that really is a game changer. So there was an MOU in July 2022 that was signed by the President of the European Commission and the President of Azerbaijan. And then there was a follow-up MOU that was signed, or it's really an agreement that was signed in December of last year between Hungary, Romania, Georgia, and Azerbaijan in the presence of the same President of the European Commission. So the July 2022 MOU has 3 parts. There's a shared commitment to double the capacity of gas that originates in Azerbaijan and ends up in the European Union. And that means that you have to add a whole bunch of compressors to the existing pipeline network, which is technically feasible to do, doesn't take that much time to do. And the consequence of this was two very important policy reversals by the European Union. First, the EU in this document committed to support, I'm quoting, long-term predictable and stable contracts. And this is a policy reversal because for a number of years the EU had explicitly decided that it wasn't going to do that. It wasn't going to sign any new contracts. It was basically going to rely on Russian gas and LNG and all that business, and to acquire whatever else was needed through the spot market. But the choice to divest itself of Russian gas meant that it had to reverse that policy. And Azerbaijan was there. The second policy reversal had to do with financing, right? Again, there was this commitment not to, by banks like the EBRD or the European Investment Bank or even some of the commercial banks because of shareholder pressure and so on, there was this understanding that no new hydrocarbon projects would be financed. And that's basically out the window now. So that's the first part of this July 2022 agreement. The second part has to do with the promotion of renewable electricity generation. And then the third part has to do with renewable hydrogen. Now, there's something also that's of geopolitical importance here to understand. The agreement that produced this MOU, but the original Southern Gas Corridor project in general, was really based on a serious negotiation, a real and substantive negotiation. And that's not usually the way the European Union negotiates, and NATO for that matter, negotiates with partners from this part of the world, whether they're in Central Asia, in the South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Usually the way this works is that the Brussels party says, here's what you need to do, we're going to evaluate your progress, and when we're satisfied, then you get to move forward. And that's not really a negotiation. It's like a car inspection, you know, where you have a checklist, you show up, before you register your car, the inspector has to make sure that your car is in accordance with whatever laws and regulations are there. And you don't say, well, wait a second, I know my taillight is busted, but on my word, I'll get it fixed in the next 6 months, but just let it go. It doesn't work that way. Well, I'm from Serbia, so it works that way in Serbia, but in principle, that's not the way it should work. You just have to fulfill the criteria. But all of these agreements were not conducted on the basis of that kind of a negotiation. All right, and then the second one, the second important one, this agreement or MOU was from December of 2022. So again, Romania, Hungary, Azerbaijan, Georgia. And this fundamentally has to do then with the Black Sea region, right? The agreement was about the supply of green energy. Azerbaijan is going to supply solar and wind power, onshore and especially offshore sources. Georgia is going to supply a whole bunch of hydropower. You're going to have an undersea cable that goes under the Black Sea that is being built in such a way, or that looks like it's going to be built in such a way, because the talks are ongoing, that it's going to be able to carry a whole bunch more capacity than the contracts that are almost certainly going to be signed in the first phase, between the Hungarians and the Romanians on the one hand, and then the Georgians and the Azerbaijanis on the other. And that is in part because the World Bank and the IMF has done a bunch of serious studies to demonstrate or to estimate that Azerbaijan has something like 157,000 megawatts of offshore capacity. There's some onshore capacity too, which is fine, but it's not that stupendous. This is a game changer, because that comes out to about 20 times more of Azerbaijan's current installed energy capacity, including all of the hydrocarbons. So that's why this is so strategic. Because it reinforces the point that Azerbaijan is sort of the keystone state, to use Nick Rozdev's term, the indispensable country for realizing particularly the EU's ambitions in terms of energy and transport and connectivity in this part of the world, and then looking further east towards Central Asia and ultimately the Chinese market. And so try as you might, you can't go around this part of the world, and particularly you can't go around Azerbaijan. And all of this obviously has implications for China and for Russia and for Turkey and for the EU and ultimately for the United States. You know, maybe I can end on this. Right now, Russian railways is not being sanctioned because everybody understands that the northern corridor still has to kind of sort of function. But that's not going to last forever. If nothing else, you're going to run out of things to sanction, so eventually Russian railways will have to be sanctioned. And, you know, when that happens, the idea is, through a whole bunch of agreements that are now, that have already been signed, projects, some of which Bruce mentioned, that are ongoing, to really optimize the potential of the middle corridor. So that this really does become the only game in town, not just conceptually, but actually on the ground, in practice. And that's something that is going to benefit, obviously, this part of the world and Central Asia, but if done right, is going to benefit the European Union, but also the Russians, also the Indians potentially, also the Chinese. It's one of those strange things, if you think about it. This is one of the only geopolitical theaters, so core Eurasia, let's say, in which you can make a reasonable argument that doesn't sound ridiculous, in which all of the major powers don't actually have to look at this part of the world through a zero-sum lens. And a lot of that has to do with what's going on in other geopolitical theaters, some of which are neighboring. But if at the end of the day there isn't this kind of understanding and a championing of the strategic potential of this part of the world by the countries that make it up, first and foremost, then everybody will lose. So you can really, you know, the Chinese have this term win-win. It really is one of the few places on earth, given geopolitical circumstances, in which there is room for win-win. Right? Bruce brought up, and I'm sure Svetlana's going to talk about this too, the Kazakh oil that's coming into Azerbaijan. It is 1.5 million that goes through BTC, but there's another 3.5 million apparently that's going to go through Georgia in different ways, in the Georgian ports and so on, and also end up in the European market, right? But all of this, again, is to bypass the Russian pipeline network. And it's impossible to do without doing all the other related connectivity stuff, if you really want to make it work, and if you want to get all the outside stakeholders to have to buy into it, and not to try to ruin this project that could really be of genuinely long-term strategic importance. That's all I got.
Thank you.